is unparalleled anywhere. If we had just one of those people in our country, we would make them a great saint. That is why Tibetan Buddhism took off. At a time when none of these great beings could speak a word of English, hadn't got a clue what to tell all these people who sat there and said, teach me. I mean, usually they sent them off to do 100,000 prostrations. That you cannot, that is indisputable. Plus the fact that nobody dies like a Tibetan practitioner, with all those signs which you cannot possibly fake. They're doing something right. And in the West, we just don't have the moderators yet. We're waiting. We have great scholars, but where are our moderators? I think they will come. I think the West has enormous potential. But unfortunately, also in the West, we have great distraction. In Tibet, there was no distraction. They had no electricity, no telephones, no radios, no computers, obviously, no motor cars, no bicycles. You wanted to get from here to here, it took months because everybody went this far and then it stopped, camped, went and visited all the pilgrimage places, then went on. Everything was set up with this. If you go to Tibet, have you ever been to Tibet? Vast nothing. Well, you think of it, that vast nothing, therefore when it came to their decoration, especially if you go to our temple in DGL, there's no space for anything. Look at the tankas, full. Because outside, empty. And likewise, these people had very empty minds. No newspapers, no television, no novels. Empty minds, which could be filled with these very complicated philosophies, these very complicated visualizations, because there's lots of room in there. Nowadays, the audience, mostly minds chock-a-block, filled up, mostly filled up, some good stuff, a lot of rubbish, more coming in constantly. So our challenge is to try to empty out. That's why I say keep your practice simple. Isn't it? Try to get some space in there, some openness, some clarity. We come from very different backgrounds, very different education, very different expectations. Can't say the same.
But I think my point is that we're the same psychologically, in that Tibetans suffer and we suffer, and Tibetans as a whole, they're not this romantic. I mean, Tibetans themselves, I know that they're not like these high lamas, most of them, and actually the Shangri-La myth is to some extent crippling them.
No, and of course, you're dealing with a third generation who have been in exile, which is very, very different from the kind of Tibetans who, even now, you would meet, say, in eastern Tibet, who still focus their lives around the Dharma and their faith in the Dharma. You go to Tibet, to eastern Tibet, and you meet the Tibetans there, and you come out to Dharamshala and you meet the Tibetans here. They're a different race. So you're dealing with young people and others who have lived in exile. They don't belong in India, they don't belong in Tibet, they're full of frustration, anger, don't have any jobs, or they don't have the jobs they want, are dying to get out, feel that they're imprisoned. You're dealing with very different people to those who were in Tibet before the communist takeover. Isn't it?
So
I mean, I'm not saying that in Tibet before there was no suffering. I mean, suffering is everywhere. But how you deal with suffering, that's the difference.
So just going to the first question, how do you reconcile the fact that the Dalai Lama and people like that are considered to be enlightened bodhisattvas with the fact that they, for centuries, denied Tibetan Buddhist nuns an education?
I think they didn't just see there was a problem.
Yeah.
I mean, until you see the problem, you're not going to look for a solution. And since the nuns were not complaining, because they thought, well, it's their bad karma, and that they have to just be good girls, pray hard, come back as boys next time. When I asked our nuns, there's just 3 of our nuns here, when I asked our nuns if they thought that males were inherently more intelligent than females, they said, oh yes. I hope you will never say that anymore. And the reason was because the only educated people they ever met were male. Right? So they didn't question that the reason why males were given the preference and the education was because they inherently deserved it, because they were more intelligent. Whereas nuns were being female and therefore of a lower birth due to their sins from the past life, were naturally less intelligent and therefore didn't deserve to be taken care of.
So how is that enlightened then, if they thought that?
Well, it's not enlightened, but you know, the fact of the matter is that if nobody points it out and nobody complains about it, then everybody assumes that that's the status quo. That's just the way things are. However, once it was pointed out to them, this is not fair, and actually women are every bit as intelligent as males, and often more, they said, oh sorry, and immediately began to start educating not only the girls in secular school, but the nuns. And it has been the monks who have been at the forefront of getting the nuns educated. Isn't that true, girls? You've always had khenpos and genlas and teachers among the monks who have been the most enthusiastic to get the nuns studying and training. The monks did not stand in their way. Once they saw the point, I don't know why for centuries they haven't seen the point, but they didn't. But once they saw it, they went for it. They didn't make any resistance. The only thing they have resistance to is a higher ordination for the nuns. That they resist, tooth and nail. But beyond that, the actual education for nuns, they now are very enthusiastic and helpful, because they're the ones who are teaching. You know, in our world, you know, why is it like this? In Europe also, why are nuns still not allowed to be priests? Ask yourself. It's not just the backward, you know, Asians. Look in Europe, you know, women are often still, for the same job, paid less than the men. The women, yes, they're at a certain level, these highly educated, highly articulate women, but on top, the bosses are men, isn't it? Yes. So it's not just among Tibetans.
No, but they're not claiming to be enlightened. Enlightened is temporary.
I know. But somehow or other, it's really true that unless you see that there is a hypocrisy there, they don't see that there's a hypocrisy. And since nobody was complaining, and everybody seemed to be happy in their roles, they just assumed that this was the natural course of things. You know, it was a social whatever. It is so. What can you say? I mean, that's the way it is. But, you know, fortunately, with impermanence comes change, and things have changed.
I was just wondering if you could speak to reconciling Buddhist texts to also reflect that gender equality? Because in the documentary you talked about how a lot of the texts talk about women as being disgusting, like.
Well, sweetheart, who wrote the books?
Right, but in the context of like the nunnery and teaching scripture to young men, like you're using books that are still.
Yes, I know. I mean, and this is a good point. Many years ago, when the only nunnery around was Tilokpur, the Tilokpur nuns went to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's teachings on Shantideva. And as we know, Shantideva is quite misogynist in many parts. And His Holiness just taught it the way it says in there, and about how women are dirty, and you know, you imagine them being all cut up and all their insides and how filthy they are and how disgusting they are and all this sort of thing. And he just gave it like that. And these nuns came back to their nunnery. I was staying there at the time, and they were absolutely dejected and in tears. I mean, they just felt terrible. And some of them were even thinking of committing suicide with the idea of praying to come back in a male body. Then I guess somebody pointed this out to His Holiness, that half his audience were females. So then after that, of course, he was very sorry, and he then said, of course, this was written from the point of view of the males. If it was written from the point of view of the females, then of course this would be, you would visualize a male like this. It doesn't mean that the female body is inherently unclean and the male body is inherently clean. It's just that this was written for monks, and so monks have to think like that about the women. It's interesting also that if you go back to the Pali Canon, where these meditations on the unclean human body are given for helping to lower sexual desire, the Buddha instructs that a monk goes to the foot of a tree, sits down, and from the top of his head to the soles of his feet, he peels back the skin in his imagination and sees all the organs inside. You know, his liver and his heart and intestines and everything, and recognizes that there is nothing there which is inherently beautiful or desirable or in any way anything for him to get proud about his body, right? So in the original text, it's directed at the monk himself. And then having recognized his own body as being not, apart from the skin, of any attraction, he can think that of everybody he meets. But by the time you get to Nagarjuna, that's changed. It's no longer the monk that's impure, it's her out there. And so this is how that happened. But we have to also recognize, you know, all these books were written from the male point of view, usually a monk. And you have to ask, cui bono? Who benefits? And mostly it's the monks that benefit, isn't it?
Is it also possible that those kinds of phrases have been included because in that time, in that situation, in that settings, a lot of men were together, most of them were scholars, and they're also men, they also have temptations.
Of course. Well, that's what it was for.
It's written for their position, it is not as an insult to a woman.
No, but you know, I think the way the Buddha did it was more skillful.
Exactly, definitely.
Because otherwise you're demonizing the female, but the problem is not her, the problem is you.
Exactly.
You know, one time one Lama was coming on to me about, in my earlier days, about how I was this big temptation, I was this, and this, and this, and this. And I said, Rinpoche, I never thought about you like that for 1 minute, you know, absolutely, forget it. that's what these books do. You know, the monk, of course, is immaculately pure, but she, you know, we have to remember what she looks like. Of course, but it was just a device to try to keep the monks pure. But what happened was that it demonized the women, and then when women came to read the books, they, as it was written in the sutras, they took it on board and therefore felt themselves to be very inadequate, which is very sad. Would be different if it was written by a woman.
But I don't think that a woman would write it.
She wouldn't write like that at all. No, she wouldn't. She wouldn't. Yeah, it's okay.
Just getting back to the high ordination thing, what do you think were the conditions prevailing in the Buddha's time when Mount Prajapati begged him to have a woman's order, that he said yes only on the condition that the highest of the women was always subordinate to the lowest of the monks, the highest of the monks. What do you think were the conditions that led the Buddha to say that? Or do you believe he said it in court?
I asked me dance. I think it's very possible the Buddha didn't say it, but the problem is because so much in those Guru Dharmas was obviously written later than that particular time. Much of the rules weren't existent at that time. So obviously much of it was written. But I think it might well be that he, you know, and even today, monasteries, the local Indian population understand, right? They're used to having sannyasis, males and people who leave home, right? That's an established part of the Indian way of life. But even today, the Indians who come to visit us and our neighbors are very puzzled by these girls. They assume that they must come from very destitute families who just gave them away because they didn't know what to do with them. And when you say no, actually they come from very nice, well-established homes, and some of them even, you know, highly educated officers in the government and so forth, and they make the choice after they have finished school to become nuns. They are very puzzled because it is not part of the Indian system for women to leave home. I mean, sometimes they do, but it's very, very rare. And so, therefore, I think apart from the Jains, who were just the older contemporaries of the Buddha, who did have nuns, up until that time, a woman's role was to be the perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect mother. That, according to Manu, was what her role in life was. Leaving home and wandering forth was not part of it. And so probably there was a lot of resistance to the idea at the time. And therefore, and probably also from some of the monks. Apart from the fact, I think the Buddha was very worried about the idea of his stepmother, etc., wandering off into forests, because there were no monasteries at that time. There was nowhere for these women to stay. I think maybe he said, well, don't worry, monks, it's okay, they'll be subordinate to you. And the women accepted that because they always had been subordinate, right? They were brought up to be daughters, wives, and subordinate mothers to their sons. So for the women, it felt perfectly okay to stand up, show respect to anyone in a monk's robe. That didn't feel bad at all. It felt natural. And I think that calmed the feelings of any of the opposition at that time when they realized that the women would not get the power, that the power still stayed with the male Sangha.
Do you think that this is what's come down through the generations and through the resistance to higher ordination?
Oh yeah. But of course, you know, in certain Buddhist countries, especially where there is the bhikkhuni ordination, there are many nunneries which run themselves and have very learned and strong abbesses. But in the end, they're still always under the monks. and ultimately